Princess Anne had faced tragedy, scandal, and decades of royal duty without allowing the world to see her break. But when a sealed document bearing her mother's private signature was placed before her at Windsor Castle, that discipline vanished. The paper did not merely reveal Queen Elizabeth's final wish. It exposed a hidden burden, a fear and a decision powerful enough to divide the monarchy from within. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne stood alone in the library as an archivist unlocked a case from the late monarch's Windsor collection. The memorandum carried one condition: it could be opened only during a crisis of internal authority. That meant a moment when family interests threatened the crown's ability to govern itself with discipline. She understood why it mattered. This was not a memory. It was an order waiting for danger. The first page named Charles. Queen Elizabeth's signed wish instructed him to appoint his sister as guardian of crown continuity, a safeguarding role covering discipline, disputes, and the transfer to William. The title sounded controlled, but its meaning was brutal. Anne would be expected to step between the king and those closest to him whenever personal loyalty endangered the monarchy. Then came the line that changed everything. The document stated that Anne, not Camilla, must advise the sovereign during any conflict between family influence and constitutional stability. Her hand tightened around the page. She read the final paragraph twice, pushed her chair back, and whispered that her mother should have told her while she was alive. Charles entered after the archivist summoned him. He found his sister beside the table, controlled but breathing unevenly. The king reached for the memorandum, yet she placed her palm over the signature and asked whether he had known. He did not answer quickly enough. That silence wounded her more than denial. A dated notation showed that the queen had revised the wish shortly before her death. Something in the family had convinced the monarch that affection, access, and power were beginning to blur. Anne felt the real weight then. Her mother had not doubted her loyalty. She had demanded more of it, perhaps enough to cost her peace, her relationships, and the brother she had always protected. The archivist opened the empty inner envelope. A second attachment had explained why Camilla was excluded from this authority. It was gone. The document had named Anne as the crown's final safeguard. But before she could understand why, she had to face the people whose futures her mother had quietly placed in her hands. The queen's final wish did not fall upon strangers. It landed between a brother and sister who had spent a lifetime protecting one another, a woman who feared she was being pushed aside, and an heir who suddenly understood that his grandmother had prepared for a crisis no one had dared to name. Every person in that document stood to lose something: authority, trust, family. And Anne could lose the brother she had never abandoned. Princess Anne had built her life around duty, without applause. She had remained close to her mother, accepted exhausting responsibilities, and rarely asked the public to admire the sacrifice. That was why the late monarch had trusted her. She could make painful decisions without turning service into theater, and she understood that the crown survived because someone was always willing to choose stability over comfort. Charles understood that better than anyone. Yet the memorandum struck him as both sovereign and brother. A memorandum was a formal written instruction meant to guide future decisions, and this one appeared to question whether he could separate his marriage from his responsibilities as king. He asked Anne into a closed sitting room and carefully urged her to delay any formal action. The king admitted that activating the wish immediately would humiliate Camilla. It would suggest that his mother had entered her final days doubting his reign and distrusting the woman beside him. Anne removed her glasses and pressed her fingers against her eyes. Then she answered that the greater humiliation would be burying their mother's words simply because the truth was painful. Camilla heard about the document from Charles, rather than a palace official. She did not interrupt as he explained it. She placed her untouched teacup on the table and asked whether Elizabeth had written the order to protect the crown, or to protect it from her. The queen consort's voice remained steady. But the question exposed the fear beneath her restraint. William received a private summary directly from Anne. He felt grateful that his aunt had been trusted. Yet the prince also felt uneasy. The document gave her influence over the conditions surrounding his future accession, the formal moment when one monarch's authority passes to the next. That mattered, because his future could now depend on a family dispute he had not created. A recorded instruction preserved with the archive catalogue confirmed that the late Queen wanted William informed immediately. The message was not merely advice. It had been designed as part of a future transfer of power, with Anne positioned as the person responsible for preventing private pressure from shaping that transition. Camilla requested a private meeting before the memorandum reached the Privy Council, the senior body that formally advises the sovereign. Anne agreed, but only on one condition: Charles had to attend, and the missing attachment explaining Elizabeth's decision had to be recovered. Before that meeting could happen, the family would have to confront the night that had driven the late Queen to write the command at all. The final memorandum had not been born from passing anxiety. It had begun with one precise night, one closed-door confrontation, and one sentence Queen Elizabeth could not forget. Months before her death, a private discussion at Windsor convinced her that affection, ambition, and duty were moving toward collision. From that evening onward, she quietly prepared Anne for a role the Princess Royal never knew existed. Elizabeth gathered Charles, Camilla, and Anne after a Commonwealth reception, with no junior aides present. The Commonwealth was a voluntary association of nations, many with historic ties to the crown, and its future mattered because William would eventually inherit responsibility for maintaining those relationships. The meeting was meant to discuss his expanding duties and the smaller working monarchy that would follow the Queen's reign. Camilla spoke first. She argued that access to the sovereign's private family council should follow rank and marriage, placing the Queen Consort above Anne whenever decisions involved William, Harry, or the younger generation. A private family council was the monarch's confidential circle for sensitive personal and royal matters. Control over that room meant influence over what the king heard, when he heard it, and whose judgment reached him first. Elizabeth rejected the argument without raising her voice. She said closeness to the monarch did not automatically create authority over the crown's long-term survival. Camilla stiffened, and Anne watched the warmth disappear from the room. The late Queen had not accused her directly, but she had drawn a boundary that could not be misunderstood. Charles tried to ease the tension. He said his wife naturally shared his private burdens, and should therefore share his confidence. Elizabeth studied her son before replying that shared burdens must never become transferred judgment. The king remembered those words. Anne knew it from the way he now avoided her eyes. The Queen ended the meeting abruptly. In the corridor, she took her daughter's arm and delivered the warning that would later haunt the family. One day, you may have to protect your brother from the choices he cannot see clearly. Anne had dismissed it as a mother's fear. Now she understood it as an instruction. Elizabeth acted that same night. According to a dated entry in her private secretary's documented account, she revised an earlier succession memorandum and created the role of guardian of crown continuity. A succession memorandum was a written plan guiding the transfer of royal responsibility from one reign to the next. She feared no legal seizure of power. She feared something quieter: the gradual mixing of marital loyalty with royal authority during a vulnerable reign. Anne realized the missing attachment contained the complete account of that Windsor confrontation. Someone had removed it, because it proved the monarch had deliberately limited Camilla's future influence. Charles said nothing when his sister repeated the corridor warning. His silence revealed that he remembered everything. The past had entered the room with them, and when Anne finally faced Charles and Camilla together, memory would no longer be enough to contain the truth. No aides stood behind them. No private secretary softened the language. Inside the closed Windsor room, Anne placed the memorandum between Charles and Camilla and asked the question that threatened to break all three of them. Who had known? Who had hidden it? And who had removed the Queen's explanation? The answer would decide whether this was a painful final wish, or an attempt to silence a dead monarch's last command. Princess Anne refused to sit. She left the original memorandum on the small table and watched her brother remain near the fireplace, while Camilla occupied the chair once used by Elizabeth during private family meetings. The document was more than a personal letter. It was a formal written instruction, intended to guide royal conduct. That mattered, because whoever controlled its meaning could shape the future balance of power inside the family. Anne looked directly at Charles and asked, "Did you know?" The king admitted that his mother had once mentioned a stabilizing role for his sister, but he insisted he had never seen the signed order. He spoke carefully, yet the delay before each answer made the room feel heavier. Camilla gripped the arm of the chair. She said she knew nothing about the command and resented being treated as though her marriage itself threatened the monarchy. The queen consort kept her voice controlled, but anger pressed through every word. She had spent years fighting for acceptance, and now the late queen's final wish seemed to place suspicion permanently beside her name. Anne answered that marriage was not the issue. Influence was. She reminded Camilla of the earlier Windsor confrontation and asked why the second attachment disappeared after being transferred into the king's private archive, the secure collection holding confidential papers connected to the sovereign. Charles stepped into the argument before it could explode. He warned his sister that accusations without proof could destroy what remained of the family. Anne slid the archive transfer record toward him and replied that concealment had already done the damage. The record carried the authorization code of a senior household official. Camilla recognized the initials immediately. Her expression changed because the official had worked closely with her private office and had handled sensitive correspondence during the final months of Elizabeth's life. Charles turned back to Anne and asked whether she truly intended to use their mother's wish against him. Her restraint finally cracked. She told him she was trying to obey Elizabeth without losing the brother she had protected all her life. Camilla rose and moved the late queen's chair back into place. She declared that she would not remain where her loyalty was judged by someone who could no longer answer questions. Then she delivered the revelation through a private family conversation. Charles had received a personal letter from Elizabeth during her final weeks. The queen consort left before he could stop her. Anne had confronted Camilla, but the power to activate the final wish still rested with Charles, and his hidden letter could decide whether duty or marriage prevailed. The document had given Anne a role, but only the sovereign could breathe life into it. That left Charles trapped between three loyalties: the mother whose final command carried moral force, the sister who had defended him since childhood, and the wife who believed the order condemned her without appeal. Behind the ceremony of kingship, the choice became brutally human. To honor one relationship, he might have to wound the other two. Charles understood that Elizabeth's memorandum could not automatically create formal authority. The king would have to turn its wishes into action through revised household rules, letters of appointment, and instructions governing private royal councils. Those councils were confidential family meetings where sensitive decisions were discussed before they reached the wider palace. Control of them meant control over access, timing, and influence. Senior constitutional advisors warned him that the Privy Council could not decide private family arrangements. That body formally advises the sovereign on state matters, but it could not settle a conflict between brother, sister, and wife. Yet ignoring a signed final instruction carried another danger. If the document became public, silence would look less like caution and more like concealment. Charles opened his mother's private letter alone at Clarence House. He read each page slowly, then reached the final paragraph and set it down. The king removed his glasses and remained motionless as the clock struck the hour. Elizabeth had written that Anne's authority was never intended to weaken his reign. It existed to protect him whenever love made impartial judgment impossible. William met his father privately that afternoon. The prince refused to demand that the wish be activated, even though it protected his future position. He said accepting power through family conflict would poison the very transition his grandmother had tried to preserve. The future king wanted stability, but not at the cost of turning Anne into a weapon against Camilla. Charles felt cornered by that restraint. William's refusal mirrored his aunt's discipline, leaving the monarch without an obvious enemy to blame. Neither sought advantage. Both simply waited for him to choose. A senior household official then broke his silence during a recorded internal interview. He admitted that the missing attachment had been moved after a request from Camilla's former private secretary, supposedly to prevent misinterpretation during mourning. The explanation sounded careful, but the act had hidden Elizabeth's reasoning at the exact moment it mattered most. Camilla denied ordering the removal. During a documented private conversation with Charles, she admitted only that she knew concerns existed about how the Windsor meeting had been recorded. The Queen Consort insisted that knowledge was not instruction, yet the distinction no longer brought comfort. Charles finally convened a formal family council and appointed Anne as its temporary chair, while the archive investigation continued. The decision gave his sister real power before the final wish had been fully enacted. The king had tried to create breathing space, but the appointment changed the palace instantly, and those who feared Anne's authority began reacting before the first meeting even started. By morning, the palace no longer felt like one household. Staff members were choosing which office to brief, private meetings were disappearing from diaries, and every routine decision carried a dangerous question. Did authority belong to Charles, Camilla, or the woman now charged with protecting the crown from internal conflict? Anne had never sought control. Yet the moment she received it, old loyalties cracked with startling speed. Princess Anne acted before anyone could reorganize the truth. As temporary chair, she suspended unauthorized access to succession planning files, private disciplinary records, and papers concerning William's future constitutional responsibilities. Succession planning meant the confidential preparation for transferring duties and authority to the next monarch. Those files mattered because hidden changes could shape who advised the prince, what information reached him, and how smoothly the crown survived its next transition. Two senior courtiers objected immediately. They warned that the restrictions implied misconduct inside the king's household and could deepen suspicion among staff. Anne refused to soften a single word. She demanded a complete record of every person who had handled the missing attachment, because without that chain of access, no promise of loyalty meant anything. Camilla responded by canceling a private lunch with Anne. The Queen Consort sat alone afterward, removed a handwritten seating note from her desk, and folded it with deliberate care. She told her aide that she would not beg for inclusion in her own husband's family. Yet the cancellation carried a cost. Every refusal made her look more isolated, even as she believed she was defending her dignity. Charles felt the change almost immediately. Ordinary household decisions began reaching his sister for approval, and the king confronted her in a corridor, saying the temporary arrangement was already making him appear powerless. Anne answered that authority without transparency had created the crisis. Her voice remained firm, but she watched her brother leave with visible sadness, knowing their mother's final wish was driving them further apart. William then discovered that several confidential plans involving his future role had circulated through Camilla's office without his knowledge. The prince did not accuse her personally, but he demanded every copy be returned. That mattered, because decisions about his future had been moving around him rather than through him, turning the heir into a subject of palace strategy instead of an active participant. The archive investigation finally broke the silence. Inside a mislabeled security envelope, stored in a restricted cabinet connected to the Queen Consort's former communications team, investigators found the missing attachment. Elizabeth's pages were devastating. Her documented account warned of a coordinated effort to make Camilla the permanent gatekeeper between Charles, William, and the wider family. The late monarch feared that access itself was becoming power. Anne did not celebrate. She closed the file and ordered everyone out. The truth had vindicated her mother's command, but it also proved that Elizabeth had died carrying fears she never shared openly. With the missing pages recovered and the family near breaking point, Anne could either enforce the Queen's command or step away before obedience destroyed what remained between them. The turning point did not come inside a council chamber. It came after midnight, when Charles entered Anne's private sitting room without an equerry, a folder, or the protection of royal formality. For the first time since the document surfaced, they spoke only as brother and sister. No constitution stood between them. No dead monarch could answer for them. What happened next transformed the Queen's final wish from a weapon into a promise. Charles arrived alone and found Anne placing the original memorandum inside a secure case. He asked whether she intended to send it to constitutional advisors the following morning. Those advisors were specialists who helped the sovereign understand how private royal decisions might affect the crown's public and legal stability. Their involvement mattered because once the document entered that process, the family crisis could no longer be contained as a private disagreement. Anne closed the case, but did not lock it. She told her brother that she would enact the wish only if he understood one thing. She did not want control over him. Her deepest fear was becoming the instrument through which their mother continued judging him from beyond the grave. She wanted to protect the monarchy, not turn Elizabeth's memory into a permanent threat hanging over his reign. The king finally admitted why he had delayed revealing the earlier warning. During their private conversation, he confessed that he had felt ashamed. Acknowledging the guardianship seemed to mean admitting that his mother doubted his judgment, his marriage, and perhaps his ability to rule without protection. Anne refused to let that shame define him. She reminded Charles that Elizabeth had doubted every sovereign's judgment, including her own. The late Queen built safeguards because the crown had to survive human weakness, not pretend that rulers were free from it. That distinction mattered. It turned the document from a personal insult into a defense against mistakes any monarch could make. Charles told his sister that he needed her. Then he asked for one promise. She must never use the role to punish Camilla or settle old family grievances. Anne answered clearly. She would protect the institution, preserve William's independence, and ensure the Queen consort was treated fairly. But she would never allow marriage to override accountable decision-making. The king signed a revised appointment, establishing Anne as guardian of crown continuity. The role now carried defined limits, written review procedures, and no authority over the sovereign's constitutional acts, meaning she could advise and safeguard internal conduct, but could not overrule the monarch's official powers. Charles then handed her Elizabeth's private letter. Anne reached the final line and stopped. Her mother had called her the one who will hold them together when holding them together hurts. Anne finally cried. Her brother sat beside her without speaking, and for several minutes they grieved not as royal figures, but as two children confronting the final expectations of their mother. They had found a way to honor Elizabeth without surrendering to her fears. But outside those walls, the recovered document was already becoming a national reckoning. At dawn, Britain learned that the late Queen had left behind more than memories and ceremonial instructions. She had designed a safeguard for the monarchy and placed it in the hands of the daughter who had spent her life avoiding the spotlight. The revelation moved from breakfast broadcasts to palace gates within minutes. Yet one newspaper image captured the public mood more powerfully than any debate. Anne alone, carrying a duty she had never requested. A national newspaper printed the words, "The Queen's Last Command," across its front page, beneath an image of Princess Anne leaving Windsor with the sealed archive case held against her side. The role of guardian of crown continuity meant responsibility for protecting internal stability during family disputes, but it did not place her above the king. That distinction mattered because the country was not witnessing a transfer of sovereignty. It was witnessing the creation of a safeguard against private influence. A leading morning broadcaster described the appointment as Elizabeth's final act of institutional protection. The presenter explained that Anne could advise, review internal conduct, and protect succession planning, but she could not overrule Charles. The framing changed the story. What had first looked like a challenge to the monarch now appeared to be an attempt to strengthen his reign. Crowds gathered beside the gates of Buckingham Palace. Some left flowers for the late Queen. Others placed handwritten notes thanking her daughter for accepting the burden no one else could carry. One elderly woman told a live reporter, "She never asked to be first, but the Queen knew she would stand when others stepped back." The recorded interview spread across broadcasts and became the emotional phrase of the day. Camilla watched the coverage privately and felt each accusation harden around her. The Queen consort told Charles that she would accept the new structure, but she would not accept being portrayed as an enemy of the crown. The king understood her pain, yet he also knew that public trust would collapse if the palace appeared to hide the recovered attachment again. Anne answered through a short official statement. She declared that the appointment was not a judgment against any individual, but a commitment to trust, accountability, and continuity inside the royal household. Her words mattered because restraint denied the scandal what it wanted most: revenge. William then appeared beside his aunt at a scheduled engagement. The prince allowed her to speak first, a deliberate gesture showing that her authority came from service, not ambition. His support transformed the moment from private conflict into visible unity. Charles issued the final palace announcement, confirming Anne's appointment, the recovery of the complete document, and strict new rules preventing private offices from interfering with succession-related records. The public mood shifted from suspicion toward respect. The dominant image was no longer a divided family. It was a grieving daughter, accepting her mother's last request without turning it into a weapon. The world had delivered its judgment, but the final verdict belonged to Anne, and to the choice she made about what Elizabeth's final wish would ultimately mean. The hidden document began as a threat to the royal family's unity. It exposed Elizabeth's private fears, reopened an old confrontation, and forced Anne to choose between obedience to her mother and loyalty to her living brother. But its true meaning was not found in the authority it granted. It was found in the restraint with which that authority was used. The Princess Royal had been given the power to divide the palace, and chose instead to rebuild it. Anne formally accepted the position of guardian of crown continuity during a small family gathering at Windsor. Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine stood with her, without public ceremony or royal spectacle. The role was a formal safeguard, designed to protect internal stability, family accountability, and the future transfer of responsibility. Its purpose mattered because the monarchy could not survive if private influence remained stronger than transparent rules. Anne placed the original memorandum on the table and declared that it would remain inside the royal archives, the secure collection preserving the monarchy's most important records. She would not display it as evidence against anyone. She would not use her mother's words to prolong humiliation. Elizabeth's final wish would guide the family, not haunt it. Charles acknowledged what the document had forced him to confront. The king admitted that personal loyalty could blur institutional responsibility, especially when love and power occupied the same room. He thanked his sister for protecting his reign without trying to control it. Anne accepted the words quietly, because both understood how close the crisis had come to breaking them. Camilla then addressed her directly. The Queen consort admitted that the recovered attachment had caused deep pain, but it had also exposed the danger of allowing private staff to act defensively in her name. She accepted the new boundaries and offered full cooperation. Anne did not give easy absolution. She said trust must be rebuilt through conduct, not declarations. Then she extended her hand. William received written assurance that every decision concerning his future role would be shared directly with him. The prince would no longer be discussed through competing household offices or treated as a distant subject of palace planning. Catherine stood beside him, and together they understood that Elizabeth's goal had never been to accelerate an accession. It had been to protect an orderly transition when the time naturally came. Anne returned alone to the Windsor Library, where the ordeal had begun. She touched her mother's signature, closed the archival case, and said softly that the family was still standing. The document had not weakened Charles, removed Camilla, or rushed William toward the throne. It had created limits that strengthened them all. Anne finally understood that her mother had never asked her to dominate the family. Elizabeth had asked her to stop love, fear, and ambition from tearing it apart. The monarchy emerged changed but intact. Charles remained sovereign. Camilla remained beside him. William's future stood protected. Anne became the guardian her mother always believed she could be. There was nothing left to uncover, and no final battle waiting beyond the palace doors. The Queen's wish had been honored, Anne's family had endured, and her greatest act of duty was complete. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.